In this video, I'm going to share with you guys how to sell your property with tenants in it in Ontario. My name is Daniel Hale. I'm a real estate agent that works with a ton of investors, which means I deal with a lot of tenants and I sell a lot of tenanted properties. And in Ontario, we have specific laws and guidelines that we have to follow with the landlord and tenant board. So make sure you do it right because you do not want to get sued. There's two things that every landlord needs to make sure happens every time you sell your property with tenants in it. You make sure you do not get sued and you sell it legally, because I've seen this happen many times. Landlords, they sell the property with an agent that doesn't understand what they're doing, or they do it themselves and they do it illegally, and the tenant sticks to their rights and they actually will end up suing you for a lot of money. And that sucks because this is your investment property, so make sure that doesn't happen. My next point, you want to sell it for top dollar. Just because there's a tenant in it doesn't mean you can't sell it for top dollar. You can, you just have to do it right. And remember, this is your investment property. You didn't buy this to sell it for a lot less than what it's worth, or to give 10, 20, 30, 40 plus $1,000 back to the tenant. You bought this property to make money, and that's exactly what you're gonna do. So let's get into how to sell your property with tenants in it in Ontario. So the first thing that you wanna do is you wanna review the lease. You need to check if that tenant is still on a fixed term and when it ends, or if that tenant is on a month-to-month term. Now, if they are on a month-to-month lease, you cannot evict them until the end of that lease term, or you can start the eviction process 60 days before the lease term ends. If they are on a month-to-month term, you have more options for the eviction process. However, you still have to do it legally, and there is a process for this, which we're going to get into. So after you're done reviewing the lease and you know the term and when that tenancy ends, you are now going to give notice to your tenants, letting them know that you are planning to sell the property. Do not just surprise them and put a for sale sign up on the front lawn and, oh hey tenant, I'm selling the property. They do deserve to know, and it does start things off on a good foot, because if they're a good tenant, maybe they'll already start looking for another place or work with you on this process. But I understand a lot of tenants, they stick to their guns and they do not do that. But you still want to give that tenant notice and let them know that the property is going up for sale. Now the next step, you want to schedule an appointment to go in and meet with the tenant. Give them 24 hours to go in and speak to them. What you want to do here is you want to talk to them about the sale, and preferably have your real estate agent do this. Not just any real estate agent. They need to know the landlord and tenant board laws, and they need to have experience selling tenanted properties. Remember, they're taking control to make sure you don't get sued, because the onus is on you if they screw up, not the agent. And it also helps separate you from the tenant and put somebody in front of the tenant that understands all their legal rights and shows more authority to that tenant, and the tenant will respect them more when they see, wow, this person knows their rights, and they'll start to listen to you and make this process easier. And during that conversation, you want to make sure that you explain the rights of the tenant and the rights of the landlord, because both parties do have rights during a sale, and this will show the tenant that you know what you're talking about, which gains more authority, and they start to look at you like, oh, I can't pull the wool over this guy's eyes. He knows what he's talking about, and he's going to get this sale no matter what. Now here's the things that you want to explain to the tenant. That they do have the right to stay in the property during the sale. This is the truth. You cannot evict them just to sell your house. They are allowed to stay in the property during the sale. And I also tell the tenants that if an investor buys the property, you also have the right to stay. The investor would then have to assume the tenant and take over the current existing tenancy. Now here's the truth. If your property is rented below market value, an investor is not gonna buy it unless they get it for a really low price. But let's be honest, that doesn't work for you guys because you don't want to sell it at a really low price. If the property's rented at market value, an investor will buy it all day long, and there's a very high probability that that tenant can stay, which both parties are happy. You don't have to go to the landlord and tenant board. You don't have to deal with any legal issues or anything that could happen. Now, the next thing that I explained to the tenant is that if somebody's going to purchase the property for their own personal use, then I would have to issue them an N12 notice of eviction for the buyer's personal use. Now, that notice has to be given to the tenant 60 days from the day they pay rent. So if they pay rent on the 1st of the month, you give it to them on the 1st of the month, and they have 60 days to vacate the property after that notice is received. Which leads me to my next question that I'm gonna ask the tenant. Are you open to a settlement and come to an agreement to give us vacant possession so we can sell the property? And I try to negotiate what's called a cash for keys scenario. Now, I'm not about to give the tenant $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. Some of them will ask for an outrageous amount. And like I mentioned, you're not here to give the tenant a ton of money and lose out on your profits with your investment property. Now, if they are under market value, the tenant is paying a low rent, there's a high probability they are gonna ask you for a lot of money to vacate the property, because they're gonna run the numbers to see how much it's gonna cost them to go into their next place. I've seen this happen many, many times. So pro tip, never rent your property under market value. But here's the thing, if the tenant asks me for a high amount of money, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, I then say to the tenant, unfortunately that number is too high and we're not willing to do that. I will just sell the property to somebody that's gonna move in for their own personal use, or somebody that's willing to assume the existing tenancy. But I will let them know if somebody purchases the property for their own personal use. With the N12 notice of eviction, they are only entitled to 1 month's rent. So if I am offering them cash for keys of $5,000 or something along those lines, and they say no, there is a chance that they're gonna get evicted and only compensated 1 month's rent. Now, when the tenant understands and sees this, they start to think to themselves, should I take the money or should I go with the N12 and only get 1 month's rent and I lose my place? Which one would you pick? You're gonna take the money. A lot of times they do. Sometimes they don't, but that's okay. We still go the N12 legal process because sometimes they think you're lying. Now, after I'm done speaking to that tenant, a lot of times they'll call a paralegal, or what they will do is they will go and check online and verify these facts themselves. Once they see that I'm telling them the truth, because I'm not here to lie to them, I'm here to work with them because it makes the sale process easier, they end up coming back and negotiating different terms. Now, $5,000 is not a lot of money for a cash for keys scenario. I will give a couple grand because, again, with them vacant, I can stage that house, I can do some renovations, I can prepare it. Just make sure that if you come to an agreement with that tenant, they sign an N11 form, which is a notice to end the tenancy in agreement with the landlord and with the tenant. That means they cannot come back later when you put it back up for sale or do what you want to do. They agreed, you paid them the money, and you got your property back vacant. Now, lastly, before I leave the property, I tell the tenants that they will receive 24 hours notice for every showing. A lot of tenants will try to set the schedule themselves, and the answer is no. You will receive 24 hours notice for every showing, and they will be within reasonable hours. We won't send somebody here at 6 a.m. We won't send somebody here at midnight. But from 8 in the morning until 9 p.m., there will be showings at the property, and you will receive 24 hours notice. That is all we are responsible to give you, and that is the landlord's right. Now, if the tenant does not cooperate with that, they don't let somebody in during a showing, or they lock a door and they don't let anybody in, if they interfere with anything during that showing, they don't cooperate, I will then issue them an N5 eviction notice for interference of lawful privilege. I have the privilege as a landlord to sell my property. I've given you 24 hours notice. If you interfere, I will give you the N5 notice of eviction. Now, the tenant has 7 days to correct their behavior. If they do not correct their behavior, I will then issue the L2 to the landlord and tenant board to begin the eviction process with the landlord and tenant board. Once the tenant receives these notices, trust me, they will start to cooperate. Now, with all of that being said, I do try to work with the tenants and keep things amicable, but if they're giving you a really hard time, then you have to take control. Remember, you as the landlord are in control, and you as the landlord want to sell your property for top dollar, so you have to make sure that you do these things. Now, after this conversation is over, hopefully it went great. If not, and you have a tenant that's causing a lot of problems, that's okay. We keep moving forward and we stick to these procedures. When you leave the property, you're now going to tell them that you will be returning back to the property to take measurements and take photos for the sale of the property. Now here's the thing, the tenant does have the right to tell you no photos. They do not want any of their personal belongings and any pictures online. So pro tip, before you ever rent out your property to a tenant, make sure you take photos of it beforehand so you can use them later in the future if that tenant ever says no and you want to sell. If they say no, you can go back to when you purchased the property and get the photos from MLS on when you bought that property and just use those and put in the description of the sale that it's currently tenanted and this is from when it was vacant. After I go in and I get my measurements, I get my photos, if they allow me to take them, I then tell them when the property is going up for sale. I want them to have notice for everything so that they can prepare, and hopefully behind the scenes, they can start preparing to find a new place. So I tell them when the property is gonna go up for sale and that they will start to get 24 hours notice for each showing, which I set up automatically. So every time another agent books a showing or buyer books a showing to the property, they receive an automatic notice in their email and text message, which I highly recommend. Everything you do when it comes to communicating with that tenant during this whole entire process is through email, so you have everything documented. Now the property is up for sale, you've gotten your showings, people are starting to present offers. This is the most important part. It's very crucial that your real estate agent knows what he's doing, because once that offer is signed, there's no going back. You can get yourself in legal trouble. So when it comes to the offers, here's what you need to do. When you see the offer that you like, your real estate agent needs to call the other real estate agent and simply ask them, what is your buyer's intended use? Will they be moving into the property or are they purchasing it for an investment? This is going to tell you what clauses you need to have in the agreement of purchase and sale to keep you protected. If it is an investor, do not put that you will give vacant possession. You are not allowed to do this. You can get sued. The tenant can take you to the landlord and tenant board and you will lose, and you will be entitled to pay them a lot of money, or the deal will fall through at the closing date. The investor will now not close on the property if he sees the tenant has not left. Then he will also start trying to come after you for compensation and recover his losses. Now let's say it is an investor and he's willing to pay cash for keys to the tenant. What I will do is I'll put a condition in the offer for 3 to 4 business days that the tenant is willing to sign an N11 and accept that cash for keys. So yes, then I will accept the offer because it's not binding. If that tenant does not accept the money and sign the N11, which is the notice to end the tenancy, then I do not fulfill that condition. The deal is null and void and nobody gets sued. And if he doesn't sign it, I'll go back to the investor again and tell him, I'm sorry, the tenant is not willing to sign the agreement. Would you like to assume the tenancy? If he says no, again, we're back to the drawing board. The deal is done and I search for somebody else. But do not tell an investor you're going to give them vacant possession unless the tenant agrees to sign an N11. Now let's say the agent tells you, my buyer is looking to move into the property. Now here is where you can issue the N12 to the tenant, but you need to make sure in the agreement of purchase and sale you have the following clauses. 1, stating that the buyer is going to need vacant possession for his own personal use. This has to be in there, and this will protect you later if that buyer lies to you and you issue the N12 to the tenant moves out, and you find out after closing that the buyer ended up renting it out for more money after the sale is done. The law ties the property with the land, so it will not be you getting sued. If you have that one clause in the agreement, the tenant now has to go after the new buyer for lying. But if you have no proof that he lied and that clause isn't in there, guess who's gonna look at fault? You. The next clause that you need to have in there is that the landlord agrees to issue all legal notices from the landlord and tenant board to the tenant. That is the N12, and this is also showing that you've done things legally and you've gone about everything that you said you were gonna do, and you didn't try to do things illegal just in case any issues happen at closing. You're not at fault. Now, the last clause for your protection that you can get the buyer to agree to is an extension of closing just in case the tenant still tries to fight and says, I'm gonna take you to the landlord and tenant board. I don't believe you. This is an unlawful eviction. You're gonna put another clause in the agreement saying that the buyer and seller agree to extend the closing up until the landlord and tenant board hearing, and after that hearing, the sheriff will then evict the tenant. They will get vacant possession. You close on the property, everybody wins, nobody gets sued, and you got top dollar because you sold the property right. Now, in that N12 that you're gonna give the tenant, there's only 3 ways that you can do that. Is if the buyer purchases the property for their own personal use, their child's personal use, or their caregiver's personal use. If they're not doing any of those 3 things, you can't evict the tenant with an N12. And another pro tip, if the buyer buys it under a corporation, you can't give them an N12 at all. And this is why I stress so much about making sure you choose a real estate agent that understands the landlord and tenant board laws and knows how to sell a tenanted property. Because I've seen it time and time again where a landlord will get their real estate agent to sell the property and they sit back and think it's under professional control, which really it isn't, because if they don't know those laws, they can be the ones to get you sued. And I always tell people, when a property gets sold illegally, it's the real estate agent's fault. They should know these things. And if you have any tenant problems in Ontario and you want to discuss those problems or talk about the sale of your property with tenants in it to make sure you get top dollar, just shoot me an email, send me a text, or give me a call. I'll put my information down below in the description, and I'd be happy to help you guys solve your problem and make sure you sell your property for top dollar.